Now, we have Rome being an Italian power now, taking over most of the peninsula of Italy, also eventually taking over Sicily, where we had that story of Archimedes that I told you about earlier. But Rome is now going to be in contact with another powerful Mediterranean empire. Directly to the south of Italy in North Africa, there is a former group of Phoenicians, settlers, that had formed its own trade empire called Carthage. It was based out of the city of Carthage. They were Phoenicians founding that city in 800 BC from Tyre, and by this time they had spread out throughout the western and eastern Mediterranean in a vast trade network. Now that Rome was taking over most of the Italian peninsula, they're going to look at Sicily, which they have not yet conquered, but they're going to when we get our story of Archimedes. And in this idea of Rome thinking about Sicily, it'll bring them into conflict with that North African empire of Carthage, who too wants domination over Sicily and does not want Roman influence to be expanded into the Mediterranean. There are going to be 3 wars with Carthage, and we call these wars the Punic Wars because the Romans knew them as the Puns, not the Carthaginians, and so that's why we call them the Punic Wars. Now there is a reason for this all happening. There's an interesting story. When Rome was conquering the Samnites, some of the Samnites had fled to Sicily and become a group called the Mamertines. They had dedicated themselves to the god of war, Mars, and they were attacking shipping throughout much of the Mediterranean. So they had become a sort of Sicilian pirate. The Mamertines had a problem with the city of Syracuse. Because they had been preying upon the trade of Syracuse, Syracuse got angry, and the Mamertines asked the Carthaginians to help them. Worried that Carthaginian protection would turn into domination, the Mamertines also asked the Roman Senate to provide protection for them as well, bringing both the major powers in the area into the Sicilian sphere of influence. The Carthaginians felt that Rome interfering in this was pushing into where Carthage should have influence, and declared war on the Romans. It would be a battle over who would have control over the wealthy and weakened Greek colonies, particularly the wealthy colonies in Sicily. So this is the beginning of our first Punic War, which will last, as you can see, over 2 decades. The Carthaginians had a much better navy than the Romans and beat the initial Roman fleet, and in response, the Romans built a huge fleet quickly. They developed some kind of interesting weapon, which is not particularly successful, but I like to tell you it because it's fun. The Roman boats. One of the things the Romans knew is that the Carthaginians were better sailors than they were. But the Romans knew that they were better at land fighting than the Carthaginians. So one of the things the Romans wanted to do was to make sure that a sea battle would become basically a land battle, locking 2 ships together and forming a battleground. So the Romans developed a very large iron hook called the corvus, which means raven, and it would be put on, here's the mast of the ship, for example, be put on the ship, and then when another ship came up, the corvus was supposed to fall down and hook into that other ship and would lock them together, allowing the Romans to basically cross over in this metal bridge and fight like a land battle. There's a problem with this. You're putting a very large, heavy metal object on a ship upright. It has the tendency to make the ship go underneath the water, so it makes the ship not very stable. So it's a neat idea, the corvus or the raven, but eventually they adopt different forms to have more success against the Carthaginians. Now, despite a few Carthaginian successes, this very long 2 decades plus war will be mostly a string of Roman victories. So Carthage will finally give up and sign a peace in 241 BC. It's basically a war of attrition. The Carthaginians no longer want to fight. The Romans are still going to fight no matter what, the tenacity of the Romans, and so the Carthaginians eventually give up. They give Sicily to Rome and agreed to pay a large indemnity of money to the Romans. Now the Romans have their first overseas colony, Sicily, and this is where we see the death of Archimedes, for example.